With him, he brought winds of change, unity and division. Enemy fought beside enemy, brother against brother. He tore the children asunder and pieced them back together in two, then one. Praise to he who came from the stars. Praise to he who would return us to them. Excerpt from The Prophet of Man, author unknown. The sun, or rather suns, had almost tucked themselves behind the distant mountain range when Maine and Kelra led John and their direboar into the large clearing that held their village. It was a large village, at least by more primitive standards, a few 100 meters across with dirt and cobblestone roads leading between log and cement structures with thatched and shingled roofs. It appeared as a strange mix of primitive and more modern techniques. People filled the narrow streets, talking to neighbors and shopkeepers. Children ran around, chasing strange dog-like animals. What looked like red tufts of fur or perhaps feathers sprouted from the tops of their backs and heads, sloping down to its narrow muzzle. To John's surprise, the small creatures' mouths opened sideways, splitting their faces down the middle. It was an unsettling sight, but he supposed he shouldn't be surprised after everything else he had seen here. As they moved through the cacophony of strange, mismatched houses and faces, they drew a number of strange looks and glances. Kelra stopped to speak to a few locals, but John couldn't overhear her. All the while, Maine stared onward with nervous intent. She whispered under her breath for Kelra to hurry, as she cautiously took in the skeptical looks and glances they received. John pulled his hood tighter over his face, as if it could shield him from the unwanted attention of the passerbyers. However, it could not. He stood a good head taller than the tallest man he saw. He hoped Kelra's claim that he looked similar to a member of one of the northern villages was true. Part of him wanted to cast off the cloak and reveal himself for who he really was. Perhaps he could teach them about technology and society, lessons they seemed to have forgotten. But if what the sisters said about the priests of the new gods was true, revealing himself may cause more harm than good. The last thing he wanted was to cause conflict among this people. But what was he supposed to do? His entire goal and mission had all but unraveled at finding humans on this planet. With his ship gone, there was no way of relaying his findings back to Earth, if that was even possible given Pine's grim theories about what may have happened to them. He was trapped in a strange world among strange people with no clear direction ahead of him. He decided that finding answers as to how this people came to be here was his only route forward. Not that they would be forthcoming with that kind of information. He wanted to teach them all he knew about the universe, but would they even listen? Perhaps it was naive of him to even believe that he knew more about such things than they did. One thing he did know about, however, was ships. Maybe planting these primitive people with dreams of spaceflight was a bad idea, but he needed purpose. John's eyes rested on those of a hooded man standing behind the growing crowd of onlookers. Blank eyes stared back at him, but the corners of his mouth lowered in a confused frown. Kelra finally relented to Maine and rejoined them, sensing their urgency, and hurriedly led their group to a small, thatched wooden building. More of a barn than a house. Maine entered first, leading the direboar behind them. Kelra and John followed. It was a barn. There were several large piles of thin white hay dotted around the small shelter, with a feeding and watering trough to one side. Maine untied the lead that was wrapped around the boar and let it free. It immediately went to nearby food and began to eat. Maine picked up the baskets of what they called mysel and exited the barn, walking to a larger building nearby.
Perhaps you should remove your armor. It would be best to avoid any unwanted attention right now,
Kelra said. John hesitated. Besides the obvious statistical and life support advantages of his flight suit, It was now his only reminder of home. With his ship nothing more than a crater at the bottom of a cliff, it was all he had. His brow furrowed as he pulled off the tunic and unslung the mag rifle from his shoulder and set it against a support beam. She's right. It does make me stand out a bit. Will I lose you if I take it off? John asked Pine.
You don't remember where my primary processor is, do you?
John didn't. He hadn't really thought about it. If he had to guess, he probably would have said the ship contained it. But seeing as how it was most likely completely vaporized, that was obviously not the case. He supposed he had subconsciously believed that it had been built into the suit's life support structure. But evidently that was not the case either. No, was all he said in response.
Just keep the bone conduction speaker around your neck, and you'll be fine. The main display of the command bracer can detach and be worn as a watch, too, if you want any additional functionality.
He started removing his suit, one piece at a time, after unclipping the cracked helmet from where it hung from his belt strap. Even though he had only been wearing it for several hours, he felt naked in just his thin white jumpsuit after removing the life support shell.
That too,
Kelra said, glancing mischievously at his jumpsuit. He gave her a startled look in return. John motioned for her to turn around, which she eventually did with a giggle. He stepped behind the thin support beam, not that it would offer much cover. He unzipped the jumpsuit down the front and stepped out of it. Just in his skivvies, he reached for the discarded tunic right as Maine entered the small barn. He froze as their eyes met, both wide with surprise. It wasn't like he was actually naked, but he was very uncomfortable, and he had no clue as to what these people's ideas of modesty included. She quickly threw a bundle of gray and brown fabric at him, much harder than she needed to, and quickly turned around and stomped back out. Kelra turned around, roaring in laughter. He quickly unfolded the bundle of fabric, revealing a loose overshirt and what looked like a poor approximation of a plain gray kilt. He hastily put on the clothes as Kelra reached out to the beam for support as she continued to laugh.
The look on her face,
She managed to say through laughs.
Aw, your heart rate is increasing. Is someone embarrassed?
Pine chided. Yeah. Shut up. Both of you. Kelra handed him the tunic he had on earlier, still giggling. He put it on and then stacked his suit and rifle near a pile of hay and covered it over. Kelra nodded at him with satisfaction, then led him out the door. Maine was waiting outside, back against the wall, eyes still wide with horror. When Kelra saw her, she doubled over with laughter yet again. Maine shot her an angry glance, then stalked off into the nearby building. Kelra regained her composure and then followed her inside, motioning for John to do the same. She stopped him abruptly, with a hand to his chest as he entered, then whispered conspiratorially in a soft voice.
Perhaps we should tell people you don't speak. The Northerners speak differently from us, but not that differently.
He nodded after Pine translated. Then he hiked the hood of the tunic up around his neck to hide the headphones, just in case. The interior of this building was much nicer than John had come to expect. The floors were stone, and they even had fur rugs across it at various places. The walls were still bare, but several pieces of rudimentary furniture dotted the open floor plan. A sturdy wooden table with 4 chairs around marked the center of the room, and shelves and thinner tables against the wall acted as a kitchen. A staircase to the right of the room led up to a second floor, where light from candles spilled down the steps. Maine was already sitting at the table, her arms crossed, while another older woman was tending to something by the kitchen counter. The stairs began to creak, as a heavy foot fell down on them. John watched as the burly man descended the stairs, a mug of something in his hands. He froze halfway down the steps as his eyes met John's. He slowly lifted the mug to his bearded face and took a large sip, never breaking eye contact.
Mom, Dad, this is John. He's from one of the northern villages. We ran into him while we were out gathering.
Kelra said as she motioned towards him.
Nice to meet you, John,
the man said, still not breaking his gaze. John started to open his mouth to respond before Kelra interjected.
He can't speak.
Maine glanced at Kelra, confused. John simply closed his mouth and offered his hand for a shake. Hopefully that was something they did hear. The large man continued down the stairs and took John's hand.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, John. We don't have much to offer, but you can bed down in the barn if you need a place to stay.
Kelra looked towards John with a smile. John smiled back and bowed slightly to her father in thanks. The mother had turned from her cooking and was looking at John with a weighing glance. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and motioned for him to sit before returning to preparing their meal. The father grabbed a stool from the corner of the room, placing it at the table and sitting atop it. John took the seat the woman had motioned to, and Kelra sat beside him. The rest of the evening passed by with relative ease. The sisters told their parents about finding John in the woods, leaving out the part about him being a spacefaring explorer from another world. They explained that he was traveling south to visit a friend when he had gotten lost. A reasonable story, John assumed. The food was different. There was meat and various vegetables that he didn't recognize, but everything tasted normal, from what he remembered, anyway. The odd thing was the misel. They had oven-dried out long strings of it, and then boiled it, producing something similar to the old Earth food known as spaghetti, but the texture and taste was off. It gave him a strange sensation when eating it, like when something is spicy and it opens your sinuses and pores, but different, and there was no spice. Or maybe it was more like when your ears clogged and popped from pressure differences. But what was being opened or popped was further up in his head, and felt less like a physical reaction and more of a mental or even emotional one. He couldn't understand the reaction, but he didn't like the feeling. After the meal and sitting around their hearth fire for a while in relative silence, the story of him being mute wasn't a great motivator for conversation. Kelra and Maine's father asked Kelra to help John get settled into the barn, which she happily obliged. She gathered up several blankets made out of some form of coarse wool and motioned for him to follow her. They exited the house into the street. It was dark now, and the flickering light of fires and ovens through people's windows was all the light that could be seen, unless someone were to look up, that is. Above them, in the infinite darkness, was a vast array of stars and constellations that John had never seen before. A massive belt of stars split the sky in two, shining with brilliant light and color. He felt as if he was the first person to look at these stars from this perspective. Even though he knew that wasn't true, the scene filled him with awe.
Do you see the stars like these where you're from?
Kelra's soft voice asked, breaking the silence. We have stars, he said, but not like this. It's hard to see them from the surface because of light pollution and, well, pollution. But when I'm up there, it doesn't quite look the same. Maybe it's something about the atmosphere. But even the glimpses I did get from clear, dark skies back home couldn't hold a candle to this. A sense of melancholy overtook him as he looked up into that infinite sky. He wondered if one of those stars was the sun he had known all of his life. He wondered if anyone on Earth was staring up into the sky and seeing him. He wondered if there was even an Earth at all anymore. Most likely, he would never know.
It is very beautiful.
John tore his eyes away from the sky and looked at her. Yeah, it is. She smiled back at him and walked towards the barn. She led him back into the dark building and set down the pile of cloth she had carried in by the large pile of hay that he had buried his gear under. Thank you, he said to her, and she nodded in response. She lit a small covered lamp that provided a dim orange glow across the dirt ground. He laid out the blankets atop a thin layer of hay that he had spread out. It wouldn't exactly be comfortable, but it would be better than laying on the cold, hard ground. He turned around once he had finished to see Kelra sitting on a stool nearby.
Is there anything else you need?
She asked. No, I don't believe so. You've all been more than kind. She smiled and then leaned forward, placing her chin in her hands, with her elbows atop her knees.
What do you plan to do?
Asked Kelra. I don't really know. I can't hide what I am forever. I need answers, Kelra. I need to understand this place. Your home, your people. I'm an explorer. That's what I do. It's what I have to do, I think. Her eyes fell as she spoke again in a sad voice.
What if you don't like what you find?
John walked over to her and lifted her chin, her eyes meeting his. I have already found more than I could ever have expected, and it's amazing. But exploration isn't just about finding what I hope for. It's about finding the truth and understanding that truth. Her eyes fell once again.
What happens when you find this truth?
She asked. John chuckled. I don't think it's that simple. An explorer's job is rarely ever finished.
Then will you leave?
He thought of his next words carefully. Eventually, perhaps. If that's what I need to do to find the answers I seek.
I don't want you to leave.
John's breath caught. Where was this coming from? This girl barely knew him.
My people are being slowly torn apart by the priests as we struggle to survive.
She quickly added.
You are the first new thing that has happened here in years. If you truly are a messenger from the old gods, then maybe you can reunite my people.
He knelt down in front of her. I don't know if I am this messenger like you say. I know very little about your people and your beliefs. But I will do everything I can to help you. These priests seem dangerous, and I have knowledge and technology far beyond them. I will do whatever I can. Her eyes gazed deeply into his.
Do you promise?
She asked. I do, he answered with a smile. Now I should really get some rest. We can talk and figure out what to do more tomorrow. She nodded and then stood up and walked towards the door. She stopped and looked back over her shoulder, one hand resting on the doorframe, her deep red hair reflecting the pale starlight.
Good night, John,
she said, before walking out into the night. Good night, Kelra. Maine jumped away from the crack of the wall where she had been watching her sister and the strange alien man. She pressed her back against the side of the exterior barn wall and slowly slid down to the ground behind a wooden storage crate as Kelra exited the structure. She quietly watched her sister return to their house and close the door behind her. Maine steadied her breathing before standing up and glancing back through the crack in the wall. She watched as John removed the covered lamp from the wall and set it down beside his mat. He removed his tunic and bundled it up to use as a pillow. He laid down and spoke to himself in his strange alien language before holding up his wrist. She started back as a large orb appeared over the small device he wore. It was the same strange planet he had shown them before. He stared at it longingly, before speaking again. The image distorted and vanished. Then he rolled over and extinguished the lamp. Within minutes, he fell fast asleep. Maine watched him for several moments. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she did not trust this man. He terrified her in a way that she couldn't quite articulate. he could change everything. Part of her was excited by that notion. Change. But the rest of her recoiled in fear.